Dad. She's zip-tied to the fence. My wife's voice shattered the silence of a peaceful Sunday afternoon. I was halfway through mowing the backyard when my phone buzzed with that scream, and for a second I couldn't even process the word. But the second I did, I dropped the mower handle and sprinted down the street like a man possessed. Lily, my 8-year-old daughter, my entire world, was nonverbal, used a mobility chair, and had the heart of a lion. And someone had zip-tied her to a metal fence. My lungs were burning, not just from the sprint but from the rising wave of fury I could feel boiling under my skin. When I rounded the corner, I saw her, my little girl trembling, her wrists cinched tight to a chain-link fence like some criminal, her chair kicked aside, and Karen, the HOA's vice president, standing over her like she'd just taken out the trash. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't ask questions. I walked straight into a nightmare that had no idea who it was about to mess with. Everything about that moment is burned into my memory. The way Lily's fingers clawed helplessly at the plastic ties, the way her head slumped forward in confusion and pain, the small cut on her cheek where her glasses had fallen. Karen stood there, arms crossed, barking orders at 2 other board members who looked visibly uncomfortable. She was blocking the walking path. That chair shouldn't even be here. This is private HOA property, she snapped at someone who dared to ask what the hell was going on. I wasn't just seeing red. I was calculating. This wasn't just abuse. This was premeditated cruelty. But for now, my daughter came first. I rushed to her side and pulled out my pocket knife to cut the zip ties as gently as possible. She sobbed, the kind of sob that claws into your soul and rips it open. I whispered to her that she was safe now, that Daddy was here, and her tiny hand clutched mine like she was drowning and I was the only air left in the world. The crowd was building, neighbors, joggers, parents walking kids. Some filmed, others just stood frozen in disbelief. Karen, apparently unfazed, turned to me with that smug HOA smirk I'd come to loathe over the years. "You need to teach her to stay out of the way," she said. "We've had complaints." My wife nearly lunged at her, but I caught her arm. Not now. Not yet. There was a better way to destroy people like Karen. I helped Lily back into her chair and kissed her forehead. Then I stood and turned to Karen. "You zip-tied a disabled child to a fence," I said, my voice low, calm, but hard enough to crack stone. "That's felony assault. And you did it in front of witnesses, on property under federal housing compliance law. And I know that law better than you think." She blinked, a flicker of doubt crawling onto her face for the first time. "And why would you know that?" she said. "Because," I replied, "I'm the assistant commissioner who oversees your entire district." A hush swept through the crowd like a switch had been flipped. A man filming let out a loud, "Oh damn," and someone muttered, "She messed up bad." Karen paled. Her jaw twitched like she was about to speak, but nothing came out. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be a quiet resolution. This was going to be public, ugly, and exactly what she deserved. My wife wheeled Lily toward home, tears still streaming down her cheeks, while I stayed behind and took a slow, deliberate walk around the scene. I asked a few witnesses to stay close in case statements were needed. One elderly neighbor, Mrs. Cartwright, squeezed my arm and said, "It's about time someone put that woman in her place." She wasn't the only one. As I walked back to my house, I noticed how every neighbor who used to avoid me now looked me straight in the eye, nodding, even stepping out of their garages to thank me. Word was already spreading like wildfire. And that's when the switch flipped in me, from furious dad to professional enforcer. This wasn't just personal. It was systemic. And I had the authority, the evidence, and now the public on my side. Karen didn't just cross a line today. She bulldozed it. And she was about to find out that the father of the girl she zip-tied was not just angry, he was prepared. Back inside, Lily was curled on the couch under her favorite blanket, a pink and blue one we'd bought during our last trip to the mountains. Her service dog, Bandit, lay at her feet, growling low every time he heard Karen's voice in the distance. My wife applied antiseptic to Lily's wrists, whispering gentle reassurances. I sat across from them, pulled out my tablet, and opened a folder I hadn't touched in months. HOA Oversight, District 9. Inside were records, maps, complaint histories, and the digital tools I used for internal investigations. I hadn't needed to touch this stuff for a while. But now? I was going to bury this HOA in paperwork, legal fire, and every ounce of leverage my office gave me. By sunset, I had already made a few calls. First, to my deputy Margot, who was as sharp as they came and hated HOA corruption with a burning passion. Second, to a journalist friend who'd been sniffing around HOA abuses for months. Third, to a civil rights attorney who specialized in disability protections. I didn't tell them everything, just enough to light the fuse. The rest would come tomorrow. Tonight, my job was to sit with my daughter, let her know she wasn't alone, and plan exactly how to dismantle the neighborhood empire of a woman who thought zip ties were a solution. Later that night, while tucking Lily into bed, she looked up at me and said, in her soft, halting way, she said, "I don't belong here." My throat tightened. "You belong more than anyone, baby," I told her, brushing her hair aside. "And tomorrow, we're going to make sure she never says that to anyone again." In that moment, I made a silent promise. Karen thought she could get away with abusing a vulnerable child. But she didn't know who she was dealing with. She didn't know I had the law, the files, the people, and most dangerously of all, a reason. That night, I didn't sleep much. Because vengeance wasn't enough. What I wanted was justice, and I was going to get it. By the time the sun rose the next morning, I was already deep into the HOA's files. While my wife prepared Lily for her therapy session, I sat at my desk combing through every document I could legally pull up as assistant commissioner. Marlene Bixby, Karen in every sense of the word, was more than just rude or controlling. She was dangerous, and the paper trail she left behind was a ticking time bomb. Her tenure on the HOA board was riddled with complaints. Residents had filed noise violations, harassment allegations, even reports of unauthorized property inspections. Most had been dismissed or buried quietly by the HOA itself. But now, with what she'd done to Lily, I had both the justification and the obligation to bring everything to light. I called my deputy, Margot, and filled her in on the entire incident. Margot wasn't someone who needed convincing. When she heard what had happened to Lily, her tone went from professional to volcanic. "She zip-tied your daughter?" she repeated. "On federal subsidized housing property? That's assault and unlawful restraint. That's enough to trigger a full review of her board's charter." I told her to pull every HOA expense report from the last 4 years. I want to see where every penny went. Every security camera invoice, maintenance contract, trash removal bid, everything. Let's see if her moral bankruptcy extends to financial fraud. While Margot got to work, I got a knock at the door. It was Carlos, one of my neighbors from the far end of the block. He looked uneasy, glancing around as if someone was watching. When I invited him in, he wasted no time. "I saw what she did yesterday," he said, pulling out a flash drive from his pocket. "That wasn't the first time. She's been going after disabled residents for months. My son Mateo, he's autistic. Karen followed him home and told him he needed a license to exist here. I set up a camera outside our garage, started recording every time she walked by. And I got into her emails." I raised an eyebrow. Carlos explained that he worked in IT and had helped the HOA set up a community server a year ago. They never changed the admin password. He'd backed out quietly once he saw the content, but made copies just in case. I plugged in the drive. What I found sickened me. Dozens of threads, many between Marlene and the board president, mocking disabled residents. One email even included the phrase, "If we need to use zip ties to enforce access rules, so be it. Let's remind them who's in charge." Another said, "We need to make an example of that girl in the wheelchair. This neighborhood isn't a charity. I closed the laptop and leaned back, my mind racing. These weren't just inappropriate remarks. This was premeditated hostility. She wanted to scare families like mine out of the neighborhood. Worse, she had allies who nodded along with her. But now I had everything I needed. Witnesses, video footage, digital proof of intent. What I needed next was pressure. Pressure that only public exposure could provide. I called my contact in the press, Aaron Chase, an investigative reporter who had a long-standing vendetta against crooked HOAs. I told her everything and offered an exclusive. She was cautious at first, but once I mentioned the emails and the viral video, she was in. Send me what you can. I'll run it by legal. But this sounds like a front-page exposé waiting to happen. I knew once it hit the media, the city council would have to respond. They'd be forced to look into Marlene's practices, and I would be right there to provide every scrap of evidence they needed. While I waited for Margot and Aaron to get back to me, I paid a visit to the HOA office. It was tucked into a converted house at the edge of the neighborhood, staffed by a couple of part-time clerks and ruled over by Marlene like it was her castle. I walked in wearing my badge, not flashing it aggressively, just enough to make my presence official. Marlene was at the front desk, fake smiling at a resident who quickly shuffled out the side door the moment she saw me. Her expression changed instantly. You can't just barge in here and throw your weight around, she snapped. You're a resident here. You have to follow HOA procedure like everyone else. I met her gaze without blinking. I'm not here as a resident. I'm here as your district's compliance officer. And as of this morning, I've opened an inquiry into your entire board's operations. She blanched. That's abuse of power, she hissed. You're just mad because your daughter. I held up a hand. Don't say her name. She backed down, and for the first time I saw the cracks. She wasn't invincible. She was used to bullying stay-at-home parents and retirees, not dealing with someone who had legal authority and no fear of retaliation. I served her a formal letter of intent, a request for full financial transparency, resident complaint history, and board meeting recordings for the last 18 months. She tried to argue it, but the letter was sealed and signed by the city's internal compliance office. She had no choice. That evening, Aaron called back. Her voice buzzed with excitement. We ran the emails through our legal team. We're good to go. We're doing a live interview segment tomorrow. I want to talk to you on record. Will you do it? I hesitated. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about Lily. About the whole community. I looked over at my daughter, who was drawing a rainbow on the living room floor, and nodded. Yeah. Let's go on record. The final call of the day came from Margot. Her voice was low, serious. I found discrepancies in the HOA's budget, she said. Tens of thousands funneled into consulting fees with no receipt. I also found duplicate entries for landscaping, which looks like a shell vendor. Want me to dig deeper? I felt the adrenaline surge. Dig till you hit bedrock. I closed my laptop and exhaled. It was only day one, but the foundation under Marlene's empire was already crumbling. Tomorrow would bring more. But tonight, I sat beside my daughter and helped her color in her rainbow. Every stroke she made on that page was a promise I silently renewed, to bring down the people who tried to silence her. Not with violence, but with truth, law, and relentless exposure. Marlene thought her power came from rules. She was about to learn it came from people. And the people were done being quiet. By the next morning, the neighborhood had transformed into something I'd never seen before. Lawn signs had popped up overnight on nearly every yard. Justice for Lily, stop HOA abuse, and children are not criminals. Someone had even spray-painted "Zip Tie Karen" across the HOA clubhouse gate, and while I didn't condone vandalism, I couldn't deny the sentiment was widely shared. The video of Lily tied to the fence had now reached over 2 million views online. Major news outlets picked it up. I started getting calls from national journalists, disability rights groups, even lawmakers who wanted to know what the hell was going on in our little slice of suburbia. What began as one woman's unhinged power trip had now become a full-blown media storm, and I was at its center. I arrived at my office early, dressed in my usual button-down shirt, badge clipped discreetly to my belt, and a black folder under my arm labeled District 9 HOA, Urgent. Margot was already there, coffee in one hand and a legal pad filled with scribbles in the other. She wasted no time. We traced the fake landscaping company. It's a shell. The payments are going to a personal bank account in Marlene's name. That's embezzlement. I nodded slowly. Add it to the list. Also, set up a meeting with internal audit. I want to fast-track a forensic sweep before she gets any smart ideas. We were operating with surgical precision now. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about an entire structure she had built to serve her ego. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. Karen organized a potluck. A neighborhood gathering meant, according to her message posted in the HOA app, to restore harmony and clear up misunderstandings. It was a ridiculous attempt at damage control, and I knew exactly why she was doing it. She thought she could smooth this over with cupcakes and small talk, pretending the whole thing was a miscommunication blown out of proportion by social media hysteria. What she didn't know was that a few of my friends from the federal level had already taken interest in the case, and one of them would be at that potluck. Agent Morrison from the Department of Housing and Urban Development was one of the sharpest investigators I knew. He didn't wear a suit. He didn't flash a badge. He walked in wearing a hoodie, jeans, and a baseball cap like he lived 2 streets over. To everyone else, he was just another neighbor, sipping lemonade and chatting politely. But to me, he was the quiet eye of a brewing legal hurricane. I watched him mingle casually with HOA members, taking mental notes, catching phrases, overhearing Karen try to reframe what she did to Lily as enforcing neighborhood rules with creative solutions. That phrase alone would end up in his report. After Morrison left, I stayed a bit longer, not to eat or socialize but to observe. Karen was working the crowd with her plastic smile, handing out cookies and pretending to be the glue of the community. But the crowd wasn't biting. People were polite, yes, but there was an edge. Some openly refused to speak with her. Others left the moment they saw her coming. The support she once commanded through fear was unraveling by the minute. And then it got worse, for her at least. One of the board members, a woman named Tricia, stood up on a picnic table and called for attention. "I can't keep pretending everything is okay," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm resigning from the HOA effective immediately. What happened to that little girl is not something I can overlook. And neither should any of you." She walked away as gasps rippled through the crowd. A second board member followed her a minute later. Karen's expression cracked for a moment, tight jaw, flaring nostrils, eyes scanning frantically like she was losing control of the room. Because she was. I left the potluck and headed straight to the compliance office where I stored the growing evidence folder. I added a USB with Agent Morrison's field notes and statements from neighbors. As I was filing it away, my phone buzzed. It was Margot. "You're going to want to see this," she said. "A judge just signed the indictment approval. Financial misconduct, civil rights violations, and felony endangerment of a minor. You can move forward. It's go time." I didn't smile. Not yet. But I allowed myself a breath of relief. We weren't just theorizing anymore. We were executing. The next day, I returned to the neighborhood for the emergency HOA board meeting Karen had scheduled in a last-ditch effort to regain control. She showed up in a suit, holding a binder that probably contained twisted PR statements and legal loopholes. Her plan was likely to spin everything into a procedural misunderstanding and pin the blame on social media hysteria and misinterpreted enforcement. But as soon as the meeting began, her fantasy collapsed. I stepped to the front of the room, not as a neighbor, but as assistant commissioner with a signed warrant and a folder of evidence. A few HOA loyalists tried to interrupt, but I raised one hand and spoke over them. This is not a debate. This is an official state intervention based on multiple violations of housing code, misuse of funds, and abuse of authority. I handed out copies of the report to every board member and resident present. And most importantly, I said, turning to Karen, this includes direct evidence that you zip-tied a disabled child to a fence, mocked her in internal emails, and coordinated a campaign of harassment towards special needs families. You are under arrest. Right on cue, 2 uniformed officers from the local precinct entered the room. Karen turned beet red, screaming about conspiracies and political sabotage. You people have no idea who you're dealing with. I've run this neighborhood for 8 years, she shrieked. The officers didn't flinch. They read her rights, cuffed her, and escorted her past a room of silent, stunned neighbors. Someone recorded the whole thing. Someone else clapped. As the door shut behind her, the tension broke like a snapped string. Residents began to speak up, some angry, some tearful. One man, a veteran named Ed, stepped forward. She zip-tied a child, he said, voice breaking. And we let her run this place? No more. We need a real system. Not a dictatorship. I stood at the front of the room, exhausted but steady. That's what we're going to do, I said. No more secret meetings. No more intimidation. I'll be working with a temporary oversight committee to ensure this neighborhood functions the way it should, transparently, lawfully, and with basic human decency. That night, the neighborhood slept with less fear. I returned home to find Lily sleeping peacefully, her stuffed bear tucked under her arm, the bruises on her wrists beginning to fade. I sat next to her bed for a long time, listening to her gentle breath. The battle was far from over, but the war had turned. And Karen, the monster who thought she could hurt a child and walk away, was now behind bars where she belonged. Karen's arrest set off a chain reaction that rippled far beyond our neighborhood. News of her charges made the evening broadcasts, not just locally but nationally. Her mugshot was splashed across television screens with headlines like HOA Vice President Arrested for Assaulting Disabled Child and Suburban Power Trip Ends in Felony Charges. It was surreal watching the same woman who used to patrol our lawns with a clipboard now being led into a courthouse in handcuffs, her lips pursed, her signature sunglasses missing, replaced by a look of genuine panic. I didn't feel triumphant. Not exactly. What I felt was the cold satisfaction of justice taking its first real steps, knowing that what she did to Lily would never be brushed aside as just another HOA dispute. Back in the neighborhood, things were shifting fast. With Karen gone, the rest of the HOA board was in disarray. Tricia, the board member who had resigned during the potluck, returned to help with the transitional committee. 3 others quit before they could be investigated. Those who remained were suspended pending full review, and my office installed a temporary panel of residents and city officials to manage basic operations. For the first time in years, people were allowed to speak without fear. You could feel the neighborhood breathing again. The clubhouse, once Karen's personal fortress, was closed for auditing. A forensic team went through every drawer, every file, every receipt. What they found only added to the scandal. Falsified maintenance logs, unexplained withdrawals from HOA dues, and a locked drawer full of written complaints that were never logged, many from families with disabled or elderly members. Each one was dated, signed, and ignored. I made sure every one of those voices was finally documented and sent to the city's housing committee. These people weren't just silenced, they were systematically dismissed by someone who saw herself above the law. Meanwhile, the community rallied around Lily. What started as a few cards turned into a flood of gifts, letters, and well wishes. A group of neighbors raised money to buy her a brand-new, custom-fitted mobility chair, sleek, light, and decorated in her favorite colors. Someone else donated a set of adaptive books and tools for her therapy. Children from the local school made her drawings with captions like, "You're a superhero," and "Braver than Batman." We kept all of it. Every note. Every drawing. every handmade heart taped on our door. Because it reminded us that for every Karen in the world, there were 100 kind souls who would stand up when it mattered most. As part of the community rebuilding effort, I proposed an idea that had been growing in the back of my mind since the day I found Lily at that fence. We would transform that same spot, the rusted, empty fence where she had been zip-tied, into something beautiful. With city approval and funding from both donations and district grants, we began construction on what would become the Lily Garden. A small, serene space filled with flowering plants, accessible paths, benches, and a memorial plaque. It wasn't just for Lily. It was for every child who had ever been told they didn't belong. Every parent who felt powerless against cruelty. Every neighbor who had been silenced out of fear. The plaque was simple. It read, "No child left behind, District 9 stands with you." When Karen saw the garden in the news coverage, still in her holding cell awaiting formal arraignment, reports say she had a full meltdown. Screamed at her public defender, threw a tray of food, and demanded to speak to the media. Her narrative had unraveled. No longer the enforcer of neighborhood standards, she was now the face of suburban corruption. The court denied her bail after additional evidence surfaced that she had previously threatened another family with eviction for their son's wheelchair ramp. The emails showed her calling it unsightly and a hazard to resale values. That sealed it. Even her lawyer started distancing himself, stating publicly that he had concerns about his client's conduct and statements. The more we dug, the worse it got. The shell company used for fake landscaping contracts was tied directly to her cousin in another state. Thousands of dollars were funneled monthly through sham invoices. One of the so-called security upgrades she had claimed was a donation drive for new cameras turned out to be a personal renovation to her backyard surveillance system. She had essentially used the HOA as her personal piggy bank, all while publicly preaching about community integrity and rule enforcement. The hypocrisy was staggering. The case had grown so large that federal housing authorities officially got involved, launching a regional audit of HOA systems using Karen's board as the test case. As for the residents, the change was visible. For the first time in years, people hosted porch parties and driveway barbecues without feeling like spies were watching from the corner. Kids rode their bikes freely again. People waved without suspicion. I walked down the street with Lily, her new chair gliding effortlessly over the pavement, and felt more smiles, more nods, more genuine warmth than I had ever seen here before. It felt like the soul of the neighborhood had been restored. One moment that hit me hardest came during a meeting at City Hall. I was presenting the district report on HOA oversight reforms, and Lily had come along with me. When we entered the chamber, the room stood in silence for a moment. Then applause broke out, spontaneous and heartfelt. Council members, staffers, even the mayor stood and clapped as Lily gave a shy wave. She didn't understand the full weight of that moment, but I did. It wasn't just approval. It was recognition. Not just of what she endured, but what her presence had exposed. I looked at my daughter then, and realized something important. We didn't just stop Karen. We changed the system she abused. What began as a nightmare became a reckoning. The power she once held through fear had been shattered by a child's tears, a father's rage, and a community's refusal to look away. And through it all, Lily became more than a victim. She became a symbol. We ended that day planting the first flower in the Lily Garden, her choice, a small purple iris. She placed it carefully in the soil, smiled, and whispered something only I could hear. "Now it's pretty here." It was. And it always would be. The courtroom was packed. Not just with press and officials but with ordinary residents, many of whom had once feared speaking out against Karen. Now they sat shoulder to shoulder, united by what had happened and by the truth that had finally risen above the noise. The air was thick with tension and anticipation as Karen was brought in wearing a plain beige jumpsuit and shackles that clanked slightly as she walked. Gone was the smug woman who once barked orders about lawn lengths and mailbox colors. In her place stood someone who finally looked small, not because of her stature, but because everything she had built was gone. The judge presiding over the case was known for fairness but also for delivering hard truths without sugarcoating. His expression as he reviewed the case file was unreadable, but when he looked up and asked Karen to approach the bench, everyone leaned forward just a little. The charges against her were read aloud: felony assault of a minor, civil rights violations, misuse of public office, and financial embezzlement through an HOA body governed under municipal partnership statute. Her attorney attempted to push the narrative that Karen was overwhelmed, that she was merely enforcing community standards, and had made poor judgment calls, but not with malicious intent. The judge was having none of it. He referenced the emails, the video, and the multiple witness statements. He highlighted how the HOA had become a tool of discrimination and how Karen had intentionally targeted vulnerable families. When he reached the section about Lily, how she had been zip-tied, humiliated, and physically harmed, his voice grew heavy. He paused, adjusted his glasses, and then read the sentencing. Karen was sentenced to 12 years in a state facility with no possibility of parole for at least 8. Additionally, a permanent injunction was placed barring her from serving in any community governance roles for life. The courtroom was silent for a moment as the words sank in, and then a slow ripple of reactions began. Some gasped, some nodded, and some even teared up. Karen, for her part, stood frozen. Her mouth hung slightly open as though she had expected to be slapped on the wrist and sent home. Instead, she was about to spend the better part of a decade behind bars, stripped of the power she had clung to so tightly. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed to get reactions. I kept Lily close to me, shielding her from the noise, while my wife stood protectively on the other side. A few microphones reached us, but I only gave one short statement. This wasn't just about my daughter. It was about every person who's ever been silenced, bullied, or targeted by people in power. Today, we showed that even the smallest voice matters, especially when a community decides it's time to listen. That quote would be played in dozens of segments, shared online, printed in headlines. But what mattered to me wasn't the attention. It was the quiet moment that followed, when Lily looked up at me, smiled, and gave me a thumbs up like she knew something important had been fixed. In the days that followed, life started to return to something resembling peace. The garden bloomed faster than we expected, thanks to eager volunteers. Neighbors began forming small committees, not to police each other, but to help, share, and build a better, more compassionate space. We officially voted to dissolve the old HOA charter, replacing it with a resident-led cooperative with legal oversight and annual external audit. For the first time, the community became something we were proud of, something safe for families, kids, and especially those who needed support the most. A few months after the trial, Lily received a special invitation. The mayor's office wanted to recognize her at a city council ceremony honoring young heroes. At first, she didn't want to go. Crowds still made her anxious, and the trauma of what happened hadn't fully faded. But when we told her she didn't have to speak and could bring her sketchbook, she nodded slowly and said okay. The day of the event, she wore a lavender dress with a tiny cape she had picked out herself. We called it her hero cape. She sat quietly beside me while the mayor recounted the events, called her brave, and presented her with a medal and a certificate that said, "For courage and strength in the face of injustice." What happened next wasn't planned. Lily stood up, walked carefully to the microphone with the help of her new chair's supports, and took out a small card she had written with her therapist. Her voice was soft but clear. "I'm happy now," she said. "Thank you for being kind to me. I hope everyone has a place where they feel safe. And I hope no one ever gets tied to a fence again." The room erupted in applause, and I couldn't hold back the tears. I had spent months chasing justice, making sure no stone was left unturned, but in that single moment, my daughter reminded me what it had all been for. Not revenge, not headlines, but healing. 6 months later, something happened I never expected. The new residents' cooperative unanimously asked me to be the community liaison, a role similar to HOA president but without any of the unchecked power that had led to everything we'd endured. At first, I declined. I didn't want the title, didn't want anyone to think I was replacing Karen with a different kind of authority. But then I thought about how much better it would be if someone like me, who had seen how wrong things could go, helped keep them right. So I accepted, on one condition: that our charter include an unbreakable clause. No restraints, no physical punishments, no forced removals of any kind on any resident, ever. And it passed, unanimously. My first act in that role wasn't a rule change or a policy update. It was organizing a neighborhood celebration in the Lily Garden, where we unveiled a new addition. A small wooden sculpture, crafted by a local artist, of a girl in a wheelchair holding a flower, reaching up toward the sun. Underneath, the words carved read, "Strength is quiet. Courage is gentle. Justice blooms." That night, Lily wheeled up to the sculpture and touched its base. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. Her smile said everything. We stood as a family under the fading evening sky, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends, and friends who had become something even more. And for the first time in a long while, I knew the nightmare had finally ended. Not with a fight, but with something far more powerful. A community rebuilt, not by force but by love, law, and the refusal to ever look away again.